First off, hello. I am honored to be here again. Damien, you and your team have done phenomenal work. This is incredible. It is a dialogue and a conversation. And I think the reason we're all referring to each other in our talks is because it didn't end at this event last year. The conversation continued in many, many ongoing iterations among many groups. And the exciting thing is we all see an opportunity, and we're not just looking at it and talking about it, we're actually doing things. So my talk is going to actually be a continuation. So I put these up for context, maybe so that everybody realizes we see the same issues, right? The world is adopting technology. AI is here to stay. It's not going to just be a loss of jobs. It's actually going to be a creation of jobs, but different kinds of jobs. And we have to think about how are we preparing a workforce that is adaptable. You're going to see so many of the same words that Damien used because this is exactly, we all agree what we have to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think is a possibility to do it. So technology, globalization is another one that I just feel I should raise. Even though we're talking a lot about the economy here in Scotland, I think it's really important to think about what's happening in the world around. It's getting smaller. How many of you think about in your last week, how many people did you interact with outside of your city, outside of your country, outside of your continent? And that ability to be adaptable in a very, very global world is an important skill as well. I'm going to fly through this pretty quickly. Can I get a quick show of hands? How many people were here last year? Okay. So I promise I'm not going to repeat, but I want to get everybody caught up a little bit on some of the things we talked about, these core competencies and how you teach them. It's one thing, I think there's a lot of agreement about what they are. It's then the question of how do you actually make sure that somebody learns them, both at the university level, but now I'm going to challenge your thinking. It's not just there. It's those who are already in the workforce, who might have already gone through an education, but now they're in a job where they've tapped out or the job has changed. Or you want to make sure, if you're an employer, that you retain people by keeping them excited about what's happening. So it's not just university education, but really across all different audiences. So we need to rethink what we teach, how we teach, where we teach. And I'm going to talk about this concept of apprenticeships and how do we give practical experiences as part of an educational journey. First thing, though, is core skills. What do you teach? And I will say that whether you go to a university website, whether you talk to employers, if you go and you ask, what should you teach, there is agreement. We need to teach fundamental concepts, not just content. Content is ubiquitous. You can Google anything. You can Google dates and times. But why things happen and understand how to look and approach new problems and novel situations you've never been in before, that's what we need to teach. But challenge institutions how they do it, it's not so easy. All right. 4 core competencies. These are very much in line with the meta skills. As a matter of fact, we've worked together and we've compared and contrasted. We broke it into 4 buckets. It can be broken into several, but I think you're going to see some of the same language. Critical thinking, creative thinking. Creative thinking is about problem solving. When you get into a new situation, how do you think about addressing something? How do you look for gaps? How do you look for potential solutions? Effective communication, understanding how to address different audiences, but how to use tools of today that didn't exist before. It's not just about how to write or how to give a presentation, but how do you create a multimedia presentation? How do you tweet? How do you blog? How do you make sure your messages get out there and relevant to today? And of course, effective interaction. How do we work in a world that is so incredibly diverse? So how do we do it? I promised I'd get to that fast. So we did it by breaking it into its component parts. So it's one thing to talk at really high levels and say we want to teach critical thinking, we want to teach creative thinking, but it's very difficult to do. And most organizations, and this is universities, it's also corporate training, things like that, it ends up trying to address things at a very broad level. What we believe has to happen, and I think you'll see this in Skills 4.0 as well, is you have to break it into its component parts. So our way of thinking about that was to break those 4 core competencies into about 100 habits of mind and foundational concepts. So what is a habit of mind? It's something that becomes automatic. So when somebody throws a claim out to you, whether you're reading an economic report or a scientific study, whether you're reading the newspaper, what do you immediately think when you see that claim? We think that somebody who is trained in critical thinking should immediately think, gee, that claim, how is that validated? What is the empirical evidence? Who did the study? How big was the study? What was the statistical significance? You know, there are so many claims about politicians. You know, how many people favor one or another? There's an election happening in the US today, if anybody's following. I am. But you'll see claims, 75% of the population are in favor of this candidate. Well, the right question to ask is, who did the survey? How were the questions asked? What was the sample size? We want our students to have a lens of critical thinking when they go through our program, and then they can bring that into all different situations. And it's the same for each of these. So there's a couple examples up here, and we have published the 100 habits of mind and foundational concepts that we have developed because we think they're important. And what's been happening is other universities are coming to us, and they're starting to learn from those. They're adopting some of them, adding some of their own. But now we're also having a lot of conversations with employers, because we're realizing that we can teach those skills all throughout life. This is one of those interesting things when you think about the world. We are drowning in information, and we are starving for wisdom. The world henceforth will be run by the synthesizers, the people who are able to put together the right information and at the right time, and to think critically about it, to drive important decisions. I stop there for a minute. Decisions of consequence. Think about it. That's why universities were formed originally, was those who would educate for society to go run government, to run the corporations, to run nonprofits, to be able to make decisions wisely. And we have to think about an education that does that. So we think about that very systematically. We think about intellectual development. We at Minerva have these 100 core competencies. We introduce every single one to every student at the beginning of their education and track their progress and measure their success in those throughout their education. As a matter of fact, the grades they get initially in their first year are provisional. They have to keep practicing these skills all throughout their education. Okay, so that's one piece of it. But then you got to apply it, right? So it's one thing to learn it in a classroom and to practice it in a classroom and do case studies and all kinds of role playing, and we have an active learning format that we use that truly engages the mind. As a matter of fact, this format would never work at Minerva. We don't do any lectures. So as a faculty member, I would have been shooed off the platform already. But I'm not going to go into that. I want to talk about applying it in context. So one of the things that we think is critical is the ability to FAR transfer. So to learn these skills in one setting and be able to apply them in another. So we do that through a variety of means. For our students in our undergraduate program, we actually give them an opportunity to live in 7 different cities over the course of 4 years. It's an incredibly experiential program, but it's not just about living in these amazing cities. It's about doing things. The idea here is that they take whatever they've learned in class and they put it into practice. So if they are studying natural sciences and they've used tools and techniques to think about really in-depth research methodologies, how to validate research, how to think about hypothesis to conclusion, and how to essentially structure that, we want them to then go do that in labs all over the world. If they're interested in policy, we want them to work with people who are truly progressing policy. So Ollie shared this story. Kayla Cohen, she's a student of ours. I knew she was interested in education policy. But it would be one thing to think about it, write up a paper, an academic paper in a classroom. It's another for me to say, here is somebody to work with who's actually progressing the thinking for a broad swath of the world. I won't even just say the UK. Ollie's having impact globally right now. And so that opportunity to put it into practice is real learning. So what does that mean for all of you sitting here? There's opportunities in different ways. If you're a university, how do you add these programs in? And I've heard that the University of Edinburgh is starting to do this, which is fantastic. Push the envelope. These are great opportunities for students. If you're an employer, think about how do you bring students in, not just so that they see how things work, give them real meaty projects, challenge them, but the experiences can be incredibly valuable. So that academic and sort of intellectual development is important, but there's something else that we've been progressing that the team has asked me to talk a little bit about, which is how do we think about, as educators and those who are preparing people, for skills not just of the mind, but that make them really incredible people, able to contribute, able to connect, and able to hopefully make the positive impact we want them to. So we've been working across our organization, and this for a university, I don't know how many of you are universities, but when you pull people from academics, put them together with student affairs, student experience, mental health, professional development, our technology team, and have them all sit in a room together and say, let's all agree, what are the outcomes we want our students to have when they graduate? And we've developed 5 what we call integrated learning outcomes. These go well beyond the classroom. These are skills that we believe tie to the meta skills really closely. They go beyond the critical thinking, creative thinking, and they are how do you operate when you get out into the world. There are very few programs, there are few opportunities for students to get this, and you can imagine, all of a sudden you're, call it 22, 23, in some cases you're 30, 35, and you're still saying like, oh, I wish somebody had taught me some of these things. What are they? Self-management and wellness. How many of us feel like we could do a better job taking care of ourselves? Probably every one of us in the room. Global and cultural dexterity, professional readiness, character and responsibility, and interpersonal engagement. I only have 20 minutes, so what I want to do is I want to dig into a couple of these much deeper so you understand the level of specificity. If you say you want to prepare the workforce of the future, if you say you want to upskill your own employees, if you say you want to bring in those with these skills, here's the kind of level to get to. So let's take global and cultural dexterity as one. You can see how we've defined this, right? That a student is able to arrive in a new city. I come to Glasgow, I've never been here before. How do I get acquainted with the surroundings? How do I immerse in the city? How do I connect with the people? How do I figure out how to network? How do I start to build relationships? If you think about global dexterity, it's not just being able to handle a phone call. It's not about knowing how to say thank you, but it's actually starting to learn how to think about new perspectives in a different way. So it's one thing to come up with a general statement, but then really breaking it down into these component parts, which really start to get at things you can then track and measure. And that's what's really important as we think about whether it's meta skills, and again, in an educational setting, whether it's in an employment setting, it's how do you make sure you're specific about what you want the outcomes to be, and how do you put opportunities to learn that and then to measure progress. I have another one just to share a couple of these because it will show you the level of depth. Here on professional readiness. This is something as we're thinking about a new generation coming into the workforce. We've heard, and this comes from lots of feedback from employers, that there's a challenge of entitlement with this new generation. Any of you feel that with people you're hiring? I'm seeing head nods throughout the room, right? Understanding what it means to go into an environment, understanding your responsibility, understanding what it means to not only take advantage, but to be a contributor in a professional setting. But you can see this is, again, there's a lot of detail on this slide as Ollie had on some of his. I don't expect you to read it all, but what I hope it just helps to emphasize is that it's not enough to say we want to teach these skills or we all agree, oh, critical thinking, it's really important. Damien said be adaptable. You've got to give people situations where they practice those skills, and then you have to give them feedback. So the reason we developed these 5 integrated learning outcomes was for a couple reasons. One is so we would have a common language, right? It's, how many of you do performance reviews, give staff feedback, yeah? And a lot of times you give them feedback and you try and have examples, but if you had an expectation up front and you had a common language to talk about progress in those, it actually means, from the science of learning we know, tell them what they're going to learn, help them see the progress, and help them see the opportunities for development. It will have such a big impact. The last one I thought I would just show, and I put this one up here. I don't have all 5 because I didn't want to take too much time, but I thought it was important to show character and responsibility. We live in a world where it is being infused with technology and automation and everything else. And Damien said this earlier, as did Ollie. It's not just about getting a job done. It's actually the human element of it. It's people who are operating within a moral compass, who have a sense of the people and the impact around them, who understand what it is to be responsible for things. Things will go wrong. What you don't want is a staff of people who turn and blame everybody else. You want people to take personal responsibility, who step up, who have that sense of self-esteem where they feel confident enough to admit when they've been successful, but also admit when they have failure. And these are just really important skills to think about developing. So, you know, we talk about it. We have actually developed a systematic way to break it down to its component parts, to measure it, to give lots of feedback along the way, and to make sure that anyone who goes through our programs, whether they're in universities, we've had some high schools approach us because they're thinking, why don't we bring these skills to the high school level, in the corporate environment? But there's an opportunity to use these really universally. I didn't know Damien was going to put up a slide about adaptability, but it's something that's so true, right? Which is, it's not the strongest that survive, it's not even the smartest, it's those that can adapt. And so if we think about education at all levels, about teaching core skills, teaching habits of mind, teaching people how to react in novel situations, and giving them opportunities to practice that, you're going to end up with a workforce in society that can adapt regardless of what comes its way. So that hopefully gives you at least a sense of where we are. I can't wait for more discussion as we go throughout the day. Thank you.